Well, what happens though if the tank gets penetrated? Well, then, yeah, it can be pretty horrible. I mean, they used to say, I spoke to some of the guys in that unit, and they used to say, you've got about 90 seconds to get out. I think some people would say it's considerably less than that. But even when you see these videos of Russian tanks being knocked out in Ukraine, what you often see is a moment after the strike. It might be 15 seconds, it might be 30, where the amount of oxygen getting in through the hatches or whatever to the ammunition or the fuel, whatever's been ignited, is insufficient for a catastrophic explosion. And then a minute later or whatever, that happens. So the point is, you have got a moment often when you can, assuming you haven't been horribly wounded or killed by the shell as it comes into the tank, you have got a moment often when you can get out. And that's your best hope. But yes, a tank that's been struck, it's a pretty ghastly business.
Hello. On the 20th of November 1917, after a bombardment of the trenches near the town of Cambrai, German troops prepared for an attack from their British opponents. Out of the gloom emerged steel mechanised vehicles, the tanks. Within minutes, the Germans were overrun and the Mark IV had achieved its first stunning victory, a major milestone for this military innovation. Mark Urban joins to discuss his latest book, Tank, which selects 10 and includes iconic beasts such as the Tiger and the T-34. We talk about where tank warfare is heading in the context of the conflict in Ukraine and how tanks have changed in over 100 years and plenty more. Links are in the show notes, and if you can share the pod with friends and family, I'd be hugely grateful. But until then, it's me talking with Mark on the tank. Mark, great pleasure to have you on the podcast again. Thank you very much for joining me.
Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure.
Oh, very kind. Well, this really is a pleasure for me because your book, Tank, which it does what it says, and this is sort of, this is tank porn, really, isn't it? This is
Good
like top
Lord,
trumps.
man.
It's hugely enjoyable reading about, these machines that I guess me as a child quite enjoyed reading in Commando comics and things like that.
Well, listen, if that's your take, who am I to question that or listen? Of course, as an author, I'm just delighted that it sort of hit the spot for you. Look, the aim with the book, I mean, you could say the same about fighter planes or certain kinds of warship. You say, well, look, we're talking about machines here. Um, and there's quite a lot of history. And really, you can imagine having a whole library of books on tanks that would range from everything from sort of metallurgy and, casting and, rivets versus welding and all these other sort of aspects of how literally you make them through to the ideas of what they were for, and then of course the guys who had to use them and died and fought in them in battle. And what I've tried to do with the book, is to, in essence, take in all those things, but do it in a single volume, so that you get a sort of potted history of the tank as a weapon, as a machine, as an idea, what it represents from the outset in the First World War right up to Ukraine, but you do it in one book. And the way I've done that, so the way I've achieved some depth as well as breadth, is to focus on 10, which I argue are the most significant tanks of the story so far. So that's the idea for people who are downloading your podcast who haven't heard of the book or don't know what it's about. But yeah, that's the aim. So inevitably, when you mention Commando comics, the main Second World War ones are there. But so are a couple of key designs from the First World War and several from the post 1945 period.
Well, reading your introduction, though, and obviously with the war in Ukraine that we've been witnessing from afar, I guess an assumption I had made was that tanks. I mean, they're hugely expensive, as you illustrate throughout the book, and particularly the modern ones. And that, the tank would, I don't know if it would become obsolete because they're so advanced, but you quote an Australian general that rather sums it up very well, that tanks are like dinner jackets nowadays. You don't really need them until you do, and then you really do. There's nothing
Yeah,
else
you
to do.
don't need them very often, but sometimes nothing else will do. I think that's right. And that quote and certain other things you look at, like, for example, the production of tanks in different countries around the world, meant that by, say, 2022, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, they definitely were on a downward trajectory, and the numbers in use in some of the armies that had had the really big fleets, like the Israeli army, for example, which by the time of the 1973 war had nearly 6,000 tanks. I mean, extraordinary for a small country like that. And yeah, you see the numbers coming down. And as you say, part of this is what people sometimes call structural disarmament, which is the thing becomes so sophisticated and expensive that with each generation, you can only afford fewer and fewer of them. Part of it is the questions about, well, do we really want so much value tied up in these big machines? Are they a thing of the past, et cetera, et cetera? And part of it, of course, is just the more general kind of disarmament that took place after the end of the Cold War, and a feeling, as Boris Johnson sort of taunted the chair of the Defence Select Committee just a matter of months before that full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Oh, we're not expecting hordes of Russian tanks to come flooding across. Well, then, of course, you get this corrective event in Ukraine where the Russians do come across with thousands of tanks. And then once again, you get this argument, and I think that's one of the things that I go into in the book, which is right from the day of the first really successful use, which is Cambrai in November 1917, where the tanks do suddenly allow a seizure of several miles depth of the German lines, right the way to the Orikhiv axis during the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the summer of 2023. You get that same debate oscillating back and forward. So Zelensky says we need tanks to break through, just as some of the commanders did back in 1917, whereas others say, no, look, you've just lost a load. I mean, the Germans, when they were surveying the sort of smouldering wrecks of these Mark IV British tanks at Cambrai in 1917, you get a fair bit of the "this will never catch on" sort of comment in the letters and diaries from the German commanders. And so there's this permanent discussion and debate. And of course, part of that is a kind of, well, central to it, I think, is the desire that countries be able to resolve wars more quickly and with less human loss, with fewer casualties. And of course, that's key to the birth of the thing in the First World War. But of course, it's also key for the Ukrainians now. And then you get people who are either skeptic in a professional military sense, or the people who are sort of pacifistic and who generally feel that war as a whole is futile, and weapons are disgusting things sent to sort of obliterate life and destroy people or maim them, or and therefore a sort of instinctive feeling that they don't want to sort of accept that some new technologies might allow states, when things go horribly wrong and they do fight wars, to do so with less loss of human life.
The war in Ukraine, how do you think that's influenced sort of NATO thinkers? Because I suppose the other front, if there were to be, an expansion of war with Russia, which is a big if, I understand, but it would be likely to be Poland and the Baltics. Would it be again, the tank is the method of fighting Russia?
Well, there's what soldiers call tanks, and there's what people sitting at home watching the news call tanks, as we know. So, there's lots of vehicles that are out there in armies where they have tracks because they're heavy. And if you don't put them on tracks, if you just leave them on wheels, they'll probably sink when you go off road. They have armor and they have some sort of weapon on them. Now, to a lot of people, that's a tank. And if you say, well, no, actually, this one, like some of the vehicles that have performed very effectively in Ukraine, the American Bradley or the German Marder, is actually designed to carry some infantry. Yes, it's got tracks. Yes, it's got a turret with a weapon on it, but it's really primarily designed to get infantry, like World War One, across a very dangerous no man's land, protect them, soft, squishy human beings, and get them to a place where they can take an objective, do something like that. Then you've got things like self-propelled guns, great big, 155 or even larger millimeter weapons that fire shells at targets that could be 20, 30 kilometers away. But they're armored in case artillery shoots back at them, or of course drones. So all of these weapons, of course, are being heavily used in Ukraine, and a lot of them are vital to what's going on there. You can argue that the relative place of what soldiers call a tank, which is a kind of weapon with a very powerful main gun on tracks, armored, designed to shoot at things it can see, unlike the self-propelled artillery, and largely designed really to triumph against other tanks. And so you can argue, well, do we think they're as important as ever? Has their relative importance in the mix of things come down a bit? Then we're back to Major General Catherine Toohey, who you mentioned before, who says, it's like a dinner jacket. It has its role where nothing else will do. And so, yes, I think they do certainly still have a role. I think the big question, if you are, Germany, UK, US, whatever, is that based on what we know from Ukraine the last 3 years, but also the short war that took place between Armenia and Azerbaijan in 2020, in Nagorno-Karabakh, the mountainous area of the Caucasus, is do we have the right sort of tanks? And I think the answer is almost certainly no. And of course, it's a really big investment to suddenly say, particularly if you're a country like the US, well, actually, we need 3,000 new ones. And these things, these days, weighing in at sort of $20 million a copy, that suddenly becomes a huge question in terms of procurement. And you've got to fight it out with all the other people trying to get a hold of the budget. So I don't think, what's emerged in Ukraine is that some of these Western tanks, which, for example, you talk about the American M1 Abrams, which had shown itself to fantastic advantage, for example, during the 1991 war against Iraq, it's really come up short in Ukraine. And the reason for that is that the M1 Abrams was designed as a Cold War tank to go up against the Russians. And it's what I call the sort of gunslinger configuration. So it's going tank to tank against an enemy. You're facing them, they're facing you. And so you've got an enormous amount of armor on the frontal axis. I mean, on an M1 turret, you've got up to 2 meters of armor, 5, 6 feet of armor on the front of that turret. You've got steeply sloped hull plates. It really is designed to face the enemy and slug it out with that big main gun against a similarly equipped enemy tank. Now, if we say there's 500-600 millimeters of armor on the front of the M1 tank, how many on the roof? 25 millimeters. Now, the problem that we've understood since the Nagorno-Karabakh War of 2020, and of course the Ukrainian war on a much larger scale, is that weapons designed for what's called top attack. Now, these might be legacy Cold War weapons like the NLAW anti-tank missiles that we sent to the Ukrainians, but they might be things as simple as some of these drones that are now over the battlefields in the thousands every day in Ukraine. They can then destroy, at a cost of a few $1,000s for a drone, can then destroy this tank costing several million by attacking the roof. So what you've seen a lot in Ukraine is people with armor that was designed for the legacy battle, the gunslinger battle of tank faces tank. And of course, this includes the Russians as well. Great fat depths of armor on the front of the turret and the hull of their tanks, putting all these things on top. Some people talk about cope cages, but various frameworks on top to try and detonate these drones and other weapons at some distance away from the tank, so they don't just go straight through the roof. And of course, they have bolted on extra armor onto the roof. The Ukrainians have done it with the M1. So all of that's going on, in which both sides, with these legacy arsenals designed for the Cold War, think, oh, we've got a problem here. Or indeed, these first-person view drones, they're quite small, and they're being flown around, a lot of them now guided by fiber optics, little spools of wire that come out, so they're unjammable. So the operator of an FPV drone can say, oh, the tank, there's a valuable target, and then go around the back of it, just once again to go in through the engine decks or the rear of the tank where the armor is much thinner. So that does bring the whole thing conceptually, I think, to a bit of a crisis point.
Right. So we're at crisis point. That's interesting.
Well, at this point, you either say, so here are your options. Option one, you go with a sort of conventional type of design of vehicle, but you spread the armor out much more evenly to give you sort of 360-degree cover against attack. That's what the Israelis have done. The Israelis are the only people with a tank that's really been evolved to meet that sort of 360-degree threat, which is called the Merkava Mark IV. Innovative in many ways. It also has a system for shooting down incoming anti-tank missiles, the first vehicle in the world to be fielded with one of those. So you go that way, obviously expensive, huge. I mean, the weight is classified, but it's somewhere between 70 and 80 tons, that tank. Second option, you go for something significantly smaller, but multi-role, and you accept that you're going to have fewer of them. Possibly you eliminate members of the crew, because throughout the story in my book, the question about the volume of the tank. Now, if you imagine volume and the cubing things as opposed to squaring them, or increasing the size of the volume of the tank, has a really big effect for any given thickness of armor in the total weight. So the converse is true as well. If you reduce the volume, the Mark I tank at the beginning of the book has a crew of 8. Bit by bit, the crew size of tank, the Tiger tank World War II, has a crew of 5. Then you get to the Russian ones of the Cold War. They take it down to 3 because they use an automatic loader to get rid of another crew member. So that's another option. You still have a heavily armored vehicle, but by reducing the volume, you keep the weight and cost down to more manageable proportions. Now, does that ultimately take you logically to a sort of robotic or uncrewed tank? Possibly it does. They are being trialed in the Ukraine conflict. And so far, the results have been pretty middling because, as we know, if you have a driver in your tank with a fine eye for the ground, it's better than someone doing so on their mobile phone at a command post 20 miles away. Just the feel that the driver gets through the tracks and the vehicle for the ground, and is it safe for them to go forward? Similarly, with the arming the weapon and the possibility of threats around the vehicle, humans are still better at this than the robot tanks. And then your last option, because, okay, let's say, well, for fire support or whatever, we inexorably go either to sort of 2-person crew or indeed completely uncrewed. But you still can't get past this point, going back to the World War I conundrum. You've got a no man's land. And in Ukraine today, it can be a few kilometers, or it can be as tantalizingly close as it was in 1916 or 17, a couple of 100 meters away. But you know that the second you go over the top of your trench line, machine guns, mortars, drones, all these things will be deployed against your infantry trying to cover that stretch of ground. So that is an irreducible thing. And even if these people that you've got to move forward are actually just the crews of your drone vehicles or something like that, who are going to operate them remotely. You still are going to have to move people under armored cover across the battlefield in various ways for various missions in going forward. So that's the real challenge. And I think coming back to, I mentioned slightly out of order that the Ukrainians like those, they're called mechanized infantry combat vehicles. In other words, they're a bit more heavily armored than what we used to call an armored personnel carrier, APC. And they have a more powerful weapon on top. They often have a combination of gun and missiles, so that if they do run into a tank, they can take care of it. But the key thing about those is that they protect infantry as you carry them forward. Whereas just a bullet from a assault rifle can kill the infantryman, you've got to really go up the ladder in terms of military hardware to find something that's going to take care of a Bradley as it crosses that open ground. So they're still needed, and I think that a place for sort of tracked heavy armored vehicles will exist on the battlefield into the foreseeable future, whether they're tanks or not, in the old conception of something, with a very powerful gun that fires at other tanks. Who knows?
And I know we're lingering on the sort of, I guess, the present or the future. Is it artificial intelligence something that's a little bit too at an embryonic stage and not really at a level?
Well, it can. So I interviewed recently at the London Defence Conference the Ukrainian Deputy Defence Minister, and she had been involved. She's very closely involved in their drone development programs. And one of the things she talked about was a software system called Avenger, which is an AI enhanced database of targets, basically. So they put into it images of all kinds of different Russian vehicles, equipment, all the rest of it. Sometimes it's just the barrel poking out of a tree line. Sometimes it's the rear end of it appearing from behind a house. They put all these thousands and thousands of images of equipment that they've encountered on the battlefield into this AI-powered software. And what that does is to produce a constantly enhanced algorithm of targets, which the software is then uploaded into drones before they're launched, so that during the terminal phase, what they call the last mile, when jamming is the biggest problem for drone operators, they often lose control of the device in the last stretch towards the target. And this AI software is designed to allow it to seek its own target during the last mile through this sort of compressed library of every kind of Russian target that's been encountered by the Ukrainians. Now, clearly, you could have a similar system in a tank or another heavy armored vehicle. You could have a similar system which could be used in place of the sort of human gunner. And that might be part of, getting the crew down to maybe a single individual or two people. Or it might simply be like a tool, in the same way that I wouldn't dare accuse you of using ChatGPT to help you write your pieces or your books, but clearly some people do, and then they sort of change it a bit, and so it might be an AI crutch for the soldier in the years to come, or these things are developing very quickly, even the months to come. But yeah, these are all developments that we'll be watching closely.
Blimey. Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99, that's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. That does make me think, and you yourself, of course, know this intimately, having served in the Royal Tank Regiment?
Yes, a long time ago. They could have been steam powered. It was so long ago, but
Well, because there's a quote from Eisenhower after, I think, is it the Normandy, where he writes that for the crew member, they cannot have a big enough gun and cannot have enough armor, which I should
yeah, and
imagine.
you end up with a steel pillbox. Yeah. And you see the images of some of those Russian, what they call turtle tanks, where they've added so much on top to try and stop the drones or whatever. That is Eisenhower's vision made true, isn't it? And it is interesting that in the book, there's some quite interesting bits of perspicacity and foresight. I mean, there's another great one. You quoted the Australian general who was asked, only a few years ago to sort of work out what weapons the Australian Army needed for the future. But I think it's in 1933, something like that, that George Patton, who was enrolled as the first person in the US Tank Corps in World War One and went on to train it and lead tanks in battle in the First World War. He says something like, um, people sort of getting overexcited about the tank and imagining it can do all kinds of things, but it will subside to its useful place, in the same way that the jawbone and the longbow and whatever have in history, which is that same sort of idea that, in the sort of battlefield contest of rock, paper, scissors, there are times when something like a tank is a trump card or an ace or whatever you want to call it. And there are other times when it's an absolute liability and you'll end up with blazing wrecks spread across the landscape. And yeah, so Eisenhower, it's fascinating, that quote. And of course, the American generals, I mean, maybe we'll talk a little more now about the Second World War and the sort of mythology of things like the Tiger tank. But the American generals, they were slightly on the back foot at the end of the war because there were veterans who sort of started speaking up, saying, my unit was in combat against panthers or tigers, and we didn't stand a chance. And how was this done? And actually, in the UK, there was a secret tank debate. When I say secret, it was held in camera in Parliament in 1944, because a lot of MPs were getting letters from constituents who were in armour saying, we've got dud tanks, the German ones are much better. So there was a tank debate in Parliament where the sort of causes of this were discussed and all the rest of it. Now, going back to Eisenhower and General George Marshall, who was the boss of the overall US Army worldwide during World War II, there's a couple of quite interesting bits from both of them in the book where they talk about, well, basically our concept of what a tank was for was different. We had to think about, what you call strategic mobility. The Sherman tank had to be designed at a sufficient weight and size that it could easily be put on ships, landing craft, railway flat cars, all the rest of it. Then you get to something like a Tiger tank, which is absolutely formidable, and particularly in that, gunslinger head-to-head role that we were talking about of a tank versus tank duel. But it was so big and heavy, and in particular so wide, that in order to get it on a railway flat car, they had to partially deconstruct it. They had to take off the mud guards, the outer row of road wheels, fit narrower tracks. I mean, they had to do all of these things simply to get it onto the railway. And there were all sorts of other things about the Tiger design where the sheer size of it and the weight came to cause all sorts of other design complications. So during its development, the weight just kept creeping up as they put more and more armor on it, and it ended up sort of empty, about 56 tons, fully laden for battle about 58. And the German army for a long time said, oh, we don't want anything heavier than 30 because most of the bridges in Germany can't take a tank that's heavier than that. Well, of course, very quickly in the development, they went way over that. So then the kind of bureaucrats running the procurement process says, right, well, if you're going to build a tank that heavy, then it's got to be able to go under the river. So they then had to engineer into the Tiger the ability to snorkel up to a depth of 4.5 meters of water. So in order to do that, obviously, to keep the engine going, you have to both have a snorkel for the air to come in and the exhaust to come out. And of course, you have to be able to seal up the engine compartment so that when it's underwater, the whole thing doesn't just get flooded and seize up. So this is the sort of permanent struggle with the design of something like a tank. You can emphasize a particular quality or ability or specification, but then there's all sorts of consequences in engineering and fighting terms for other aspects of the design.
So, with the Second World War tanks, then, do you think there's a kind of like one of the reasons why I enjoy your book so much is the way the tanks look? And I think with the Tiger, it looks good, which is why people think it's maybe better than it is because
Well,
it's obviously got the heavy armor and their big
yeah.
guns.
There's no doubt it's formidable, and various battles are recounted both on the Eastern Front and, of course, in Normandy, where famously at Villers-Bocage, a handful of Tigers absolutely mauled the British 7th Armored Division in June 1944. So there's no doubt it could be an absolutely formidable adversary. And the interesting thing about Villers-Bocage, and it comes to your point, which I think is very well made, is that when these Tigers under this SS officer, Michael Whitman, started basically running amok amidst these British armored vehicles, there were quite a lot there that had the technical ability to destroy them. And there were anti-tank guns and things as well, wheeled anti-tank guns. And indeed, it was one of those that eventually put Whitman's Tiger out of action. So there were quite a lot of weapons at the disposal of the British troops that could have stopped that rampage. The question is, why didn't they achieve that more quickly? And I think that does come back to what you mentioned, Oliver, which is the psychology, the shock effect. And that very thing about the Tiger, its enormous size and width. One of the Scottish sergeants in that battle, as he catches his first glimpse of a tiger coming towards them, he describes it as, it was as wide as two Glasgow Corporation tram cars. And it's that feeling that this is enormous, and it has this huge gun on it that's just going to smash anything that it's in the way. That is a very important part of the psychological effect. The problem with the Tiger is that it's so big and heavy, it often gets stuck. The Germans find, I've gone into the war diaries of some of the first German units to use them in North Africa. And of course, what they realize is they've got very few vehicles capable of actually towing a Tiger if it's got stuck, with the necessary motive power to get one out of a bog. Or indeed, what also happens, because of its size, weight, and complexity, it often breaks down. And if the tide of the battle turns against you, then you very quickly find, well, what are we going to do? We've got a broken down Tiger here, or a bog Tiger. And in the Battle of Hunt's Gap, which was one of the early ones they fought in North Africa, there was a particular moment where they lost 6 Tigers. And when the British then came on the scene, having recaptured this territory, only one of them had been put out of action by British fire. In fact, it was artillery fire. But 5 of them had basically got stuck and therefore had to be destroyed by their own crews to stop them falling into British hands. So that's the problem. It's so big, and the engineering for all the transmission, the running gear, everything else to bear that weight isn't quite up to it. So it breaks down a lot. And I think one of the really interesting things, and I go into this quite a bit in the book, is what sort of life, how long do these things remain in service? And the Tiger, at the end of the war, nobody attempts to put it into service. Um, and the Panther, the French form a couple of battalions of Panthers, but within a couple of years, they've decided, oh my word, keeps going wrong, problematic. Now, you might turn around and say, well, don't be ridiculous. Um, it's a German tank, there's no more spares. Even if it is good, why should anyone keep it in service? I mean, isn't that rather unfair as a yardstick? But the Panzer IV, which was the most produced German tank in World War II, was still in service 20 years later. The Syrians used them. And somehow they got the spare parts and they felt that was worth keeping those going. And of course, what you could have done, which happened very, very briefly, it only happened for a handful of vehicles at the end of the war, is you could have, if you'd really thought they were so marvelous, restarted the factory. And the Panther tank in Bovingdon Tank Museum was actually built by the British from spares in the Panther tank factory after the fall of the Third Reich. So if you'd thought they were really so marvelous and world-beating, you could have made Panthers or Tigers or something very, very similar to them after the war, which nobody chose to do. Whereas the Sherman, 1,300 Tigers made during the war, 49,000 Shermans. And so, as people often observe, well, if you could get 3 or 4 for the price of a Tiger, then you could be more philosophical about the fact you might lose the first 2 in trying to, get onto the flank or find some way of beating it. But the key thing is the Sherman, very adaptable, the engines, the suspension, the main armaments, they were all updated during the war and then after the war. And lo and behold, you find them still in service in the Israeli army in 1973, in the Indo-Pakistan war in 1971. The Sherman remains in service for decades. And obviously, yes, it has an intact supply chain, but the point is it was very reliable and it was very adaptable. And I think, the German big cats were not.
Yeah, the Tiger 2, they exacerbate their problems with the Tiger 1, not wanting to linger too
Well,
long on the Tiger.
it's 10 tons heavier and it's got the same engine. So if you're having trouble with the first version, I mean, they both, pack an almighty punch. They're very well armed and they're very well protected. But yeah, in the end, the difficulties of keeping them going. There's a great quote from one of the German staff officers. I think he might be in the Grossdeutschland division, and anyway, it's one of the divisions operating on the Eastern Front in 1943, and they've just got some Tigers. And he says something like, we've got to accept that this is like a fighter plane in terms of the amount of maintenance and care. This is like having a fighter aircraft in terms of the complexity and the work it's going to need in order to keep it going.
Well, one thing I wanted to ask you about was the projectiles that, hit the various tanks over time, because unlike you, I would never have volunteered for the Royal Tank Regiment because the idea of being, I mean, the crews, if they're hit, it's a high chance of injury and death, isn't it?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting one, Oliver. I did a previous book, The Tank War, which was a sort of band of brothers about the 5th Royal Tank Regiment going through the Second World War. And although it was quite hard to get absolutely definitive figures, I was able to compare that unit, which was part of the Desert Rats, it was part of the 7th Armoured Division, with a battalion from the Queen's Regiment, which was an infantry battalion in the same division. So basically, they were going through the same battles together. And that infantry only joined from the Battle of Alamein onwards. So they did sort of half the war. And the number of people who survived and stayed in that battalion of the Queen's Regiment from Alamein to the end of the war was 6. The number who went the same route in the 5th Royal Tank Regiment was around 50. So you did have a much better chance of surviving. And this comes back to what we were talking about at the beginning. If you're going to go across an open ground swept with bullets and shell fragments and all the rest of it, of course, if you've got, several inches of metal around you, you've got a greater chance of surviving. So it did, yeah. Now, coming back to your point about, well, what happens though, if the tank gets penetrated? Well, then, yeah, it can be pretty horrible. I mean, they used to say, I spoke to some of the guys in that unit, and they used to say, you've got about 90 seconds to get out. I think some people would say it's considerably less than that. But even when you see these videos of Russian tanks being knocked out in Ukraine, what you often see is a moment after the strike. It might be 15 seconds, it might be 30, where the amount of oxygen getting in through the hatches or whatever to the ammunition or the fuel, whatever's been ignited, is insufficient for a catastrophic explosion. And then a minute later or whatever, that happens. So the point is, you have got a moment often when you can, assuming you haven't been, horribly wounded or killed by the shell as it comes into the tank, you have got a moment often when you can get out. And, that's your best hope. But yes, a tank that's been struck, it's a pretty ghastly business. And
how has the shell changed? Because before, I guess in the early days, the projectile would go through the metal and just drill a hole all the way through.
Yeah, it still does.
Then something changes, doesn't it?
Yeah, it still does in the sense that, so what they sometimes call the kinetic energy, which is basically just smashing your way through with a lump of metal. So that's the way, in the early days. And it has remained the weapon of choice, really, in tank-to-tank fighting right up to this present day for various reasons. So in order to make sure that bolt of metal, I've got a penetrator upstairs from that I picked up off the range once. So it's a solid piece of metal, and you basically fire it out of a very powerful gun at such speed that mass times velocity squared over 2, kinetic energy, the force of it in terms of joules is sufficient to get through the armor that's on that enemy vehicle. And hence you get this arms race where the guns get faster and faster, the shells get heavier and heavier, or the shot, I should say technically, gets heavier and heavier, and the armor gets thicker and thicker in response. And so that throughout the Second World War, when you go tank to tank, that is the main way. But what happens during the Second World War is that the Germans start looking at a technology which a number of countries had experimented with. They weren't the only ones, but they used it during the Blitzkrieg attack in 1940 on some Belgium forts, very heavily sort of protected Maginot Line style forts in Belgium. And what they realized was that if you put a sort of a bit like a sort of dunce's hat shape, a cone inside a shell or a charge with the round end towards the target, that what happens at the moment that your shell explodes is that cone gets flipped inside out effectively, so that the pointy bit that's at the end of it, that's towards the base of the shell, gets flipped out and becomes the nose. And that technology, which is called shape charge, it's sometimes referred to as high explosive anti-tank heat as a type of shell. They had used, just carried by a guy in 1940, but by 1942, the Germans had developed it to the point where they could put it into a 75mm shell to be fired from a gun on a tank or a self-propelled gun, that sort of thing. And of course, what they found suddenly, they'd had a lot of trouble dealing with some of the Russian tanks like T-34s, was that this 75 millimeter shell with a shaped charge could penetrate 80 millimeters at least of Russian armor. And that was enough. That was enough to change the equation when they ran into the T-34. So a lot of other countries then started looking at this kind of technology, saying, okay, well, if we can make it small enough to go into a tank gun, maybe we can put one of these charges on a rocket and some chap on foot can fire it, a bazooka. And the Americans were very good at that. And they introduced bazookas. And by the end of the war, the Americans had a bazooka shell. I think it could go through something like 120 millimeters of armor. The Tiger was 100 millimeters on the front of the hull, for example. So they had produced a weapon that just G.I. Joe walking around the battlefield could put on his shoulder and defeat one of these 58-ton tanks. And so that's quite a fundamental moment. And to be frank, I mean, this constant debate about, is it bound for the scrap heap of history, and can the tank survive? I think it crystallizes in its most meaningful form after the Second World War, when not only have you got these proliferating shape charge weapons like the anti-tank bazooka, and things also then anti-tank missiles, things like that come in with the same technology for just getting in through really thick armor. But you've also got the advent of nuclear weapons, where people say, well, hang on a minute, if the whole thing about warfare up to now is you concentrate force at the decisive point, the Schwerpunkt, as the Germans called it, in order to break through. So you have a lot more guys there than they do because you've chosen your point of attack and you concentrate. Doesn't that concentration now represent an irresistible target for a nuclear weapon? So then armies start thinking differently, thinking, well, hang on a minute. Yeah, if we're less able to concentrate force, how are we going to do this? How are we going to break through? And then at the tactical level, you say, okay, well, we'll still need tanks or whatever. Maybe we will, maybe we won't, because they're in a lot more danger now, because all sorts of people, not just another tank, but the humble infantry soldier on foot, all sorts of people can now destroy a tank. Air launch weapons became much more effective against tanks as well. So yeah, that's the sort of serious existential moment, I think, for the tank at the end of the Second World War. And, they show their use in Korea, for example, basically like mobile artillery, just something where the infantryman can get on the phone on the back of the tank and say, look, could you hit that pillbox over there? They're still useful, but people have got their doubts. And then in the 1967 war, the Middle East war, the Israelis, with a fleet that's largely made up of modified British Centurions, they make these huge conquests in a very short amount of time by exploiting success with large armored divisions. And suddenly everybody's thinking, oh, okay, so the tank isn't dead after all. You can suddenly capture 120 miles of Sinai Desert in the space of 3 days if your armored forces are doing things right. So, it's a pendulum story that's gone back and forth. And of course, the other thing you get, I mean, we must be careful, we'll run out of time. But you do eventually, of course, get a response to the shaped charge, which is, okay, so this weapon relies on a very specific bit of physics to convert explosive power, chemical energy, into penetrative power. What can we do about that? And so then the Russians and then the Brits start investigating all sorts of different forms of armor. And you say, all right, well, what if instead of just a thick piece of homogeneous rolled steel, we use different substances as armor? Because perhaps the effect of aluminium, ceramics, depleted uranium, whatever it is, on this incoming bolt of metal created by a shaped charge, perhaps the effects of these different materials will be different. Then the Brits realize, oh, what if you put a little air gap between your sandwich layers of these different materials? Because the British have noticed that as the shaped charge penetrates, if it goes back into thin air, it wobbles ever so slightly. And that if you put air gaps in, you will amplify that wobbling and therefore dissipate its energy much more broadly. So instead of penetrating deeper, the energy is dissipated across a broader area. And so that becomes the secret of what in the UK was known as Chobham armor. That, as I say, the Soviet Union got it into service 10 years ahead of us. And now some of these other tanks that I've mentioned, like the Israeli Merkava Mark IV, they have these really complex arrays of layered armor with, I think, they've got something spongy in there, they've got steel, they've got air gaps. Of course, it makes the tank huge because you need thicker and thicker amounts of space to put in all these layers, but it's very effective against the shaped charge. But, and here's the kicker, the tank firing the kinetic energy penetrator, the solid bit of metal, it's not quite unaffected by layered armor, or it is also a problem, but it's less affected than the shaped charge. So then, you go full circle and suddenly the tank firing that solid shot becomes the best way again to knock out the tank with all that complex armor on it.
Well, Mark, this has been absolutely fascinating. I just have one quick question, but you have to give me a very fast answer, and taking into account all the different elements of the tank. Best tank of World War II?
World War II, I think I'd probably have to say the Sherman.
Wonderful stuff. Mark, thank you.
I thought you were going to ask me best tank of all time. It should be a bit like the
let's
BAFTAs.
Do that as well.
I think it should be a bit like the BAFTAs. So, best British tank, Centurion.
Right.
Best World War II tank, I think probably, yes, the Sherman. But,
Not the T-34.
I'm sure we could come up with an award for the Tiger, or because I know people will be a bit nose out of joint. Some people would say the Sherman, but...
Yeah, and the Leopard 2 seems to be very good, the new Leopard 2.
I don't think it's as survivable as the Merkava Mark IV. There are some, up and comers now. Like all other manufactured products, we suddenly find that volume tank production, where it exists in the world now, which is in very few places, China, South Korea, those countries are now producing quite impressive tanks.
Great stuff. Mark, thank you very much. And for listeners, links are in the show notes. Tank, the 10 war machines that changed the world, and the remarkable men behind them. But thank you.
Thanks, Oliver. Pleasure again.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family. And if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.